Hey, Samson. All right, it's 1 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? Did everyone have a good good break? Good, thumbs up, it's good. Too short, yeah, I know. I wish it was longer too. We all do. All right, and so we're in the final stretches of the semester, and so we have this week where we're going to go over kind of some kind of, you know, as much as we can of the last of the ethics unit, and then next week we have final presentations, and so, you know, we're wrapping up really quickly, right? And so for the final presentations next week, we have 8 groups, which is actually, you know, the perfect number of groups to have for you know, for this class, because that means we can have 4 groups go on Tuesday and then 4 groups go on Thursday, right? And so I think, you know, with that, then each group will have about 15 minutes to present. Okay. And so I think either later today or probably sometime tomorrow, I'll put out a sign-up sheet for the presentation order. Okay. And so that you can sign up for your presentation slot. Okay. I know a couple of you have reached out to me that you have constraints on which days that you can do your presentation, and so if you could send me another email and remind me, that would be great, and then I can kind of schedule you appropriately. Okay. Okay. I think that's all the announcements. So for the final presentation, you know, I am going to be really strict on the timing, because in the past, you know, what's happened is that some groups would go over the time, you know, very significantly, and it made it so that some groups couldn't present. And so, you know, I will be very strict with the time, and so please make sure that you practice your presentation, you know, at least once with your group, or at least practice your part and make sure everything is timed appropriately, because, you know, after 15-16 minutes, then I'm going to cut you off, because, you know, we need to get to the other groups as well. Okay. And whatever you don't get to in the presentation, then I can't grade you on it, because it's you know, it just didn't get there. Okay. So I'll put on the sign up sheet tomorrow, and so I'll let you guys sign up for a presentation. So kind of in the same way that you guys signed up for presentation groups. Yeah. So it'll be a Google sheet, and then, you know, it'll be, you can just sign up there. So just only one person in your group just has to sign up for a time, and then once everyone's signed up, then I'll publish the results, and I'll put it in an announcement so everyone can know. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think that's all my announcements. And so are there any questions I can answer before we get started? Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and get into it. So today we're going to finish up the last of lecture notes 12, which is on organizational ethics. Okay, and so the topic for today is we're going to talk about how to be responsible when you want to exhibit some disobedience towards your company. Okay. So let's see. Style is on. Okay, so this will be responsible. Responsible organizational disobedience. All right. And so, sometimes it's necessary for you as an engineer to oppose what your company and management is asking you to do. Okay, and this is very common. So, don't feel like you're being a bad employee, or that you're being kind of a bad person if you don't follow exactly what your company and management is asking you to do. Because a lot of times, and some would argue maybe all the time, your company is not really looking out for your best interests. And so, knowing when you can oppose that and how you can do that responsibly is a very important skill that you should learn, before you get out into the workforce. Okay. Okay. And so some of these interests could be, maybe your company or your management is asking you to do something that goes against your own personal ethics, or maybe it goes against your own goes against your professional ethics as well. Okay. Okay. Other reasons you might want to engage in disobedience would be, maybe the working conditions aren't ideal. Okay. Okay. And so, they might be asking you to work long hours without any paid overtime, right? Or they might, be underpaying you or not compensating you enough, right? So there's a lot of reasons why, workers might want to engage in disobedience with their company. Okay. And engineers are no exception. Okay. And it's important to know, what do some of these situations look like? What are your options, and how to engage with this responsibly. Okay. Um, and so I'd say there's three kind of big categories of ways that engineers can engage in disobedience with their company. Okay. Okay. All right. So number one. The number one method. Not that this is the most common one, but this is kind of the I would say the least disruptive that you can do. Okay. And so number one is a disobedience by contrary action. Okay. And so what this means is that the employee or the engineer participates in activities outside the workplace that are contrary to the interests of the company. Okay, so this is basically activities that you engage with in your own time. Okay. Okay. So some examples of this, could be taking part in an environmental group that's working to protect some land, okay, or maybe taking part in a political group that runs counter to a company's goals, or it might be even just participating in a union, right? And so I think nowadays there's been a lot of talk about unions in the national news with regards to workers at Amazon or workers at other companies, right? And so a lot of times unions are not they're not with the best relationships with their employers, because the unions are there to stick up for workers' rights. And so if you participate in any of these kinds of groups or any of these kinds of actions, these are often contrary to the company, and that's one way that you can express your disobedience to a company. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. And so that's number one. Okay. And so number one, because it's off company time, it doesn't directly affect the company's bottom line or affects their tasks, and so that's the least disruptive, at least in a direct sense. Okay. Number two is something that you can do within the company as well. Okay. And number two would be disobedience by non-participation. The stylus turned off. Right. And so the idea with non-participation is that you just choose not to engage in activities that you don't approve of. Okay. And so some examples of this that can happen for engineers, that maybe you work for a defense company, and maybe you don't want to take part in a project that has some military applications, or maybe it's maybe it's building some kind of weapon for the military. Okay. And so a lot of people feel very strongly that they don't want to have their work create weapons like that. Okay. And so that's one example that you can use, or one example of how to express disobedience through non-participation. Okay. Okay. Another example could be, maybe you don't want to participate in a project that has negative environmental consequences as well. Okay. All right. But just be aware that this option is always almost always available to you, and so a lot of companies will try to be accommodating to this kind of this kind of preference. Okay. But at the same time, if you do choose not to participate in projects, that can affect your relationship with the company and with management as well. Okay. Okay. And that's especially true if you do it often, right? And so if you choose not to participate in projects, in a lot of projects, then the company will sometimes try its best to kind of move you around to someplace that you feel more comfortable with, right? And so I've had friends and I've had colleagues that have done that in companies, right? And so they moved around to different departments on different projects, until they found one that they feel comfortable working on. But it's not something that you should abuse in a company. Okay. All right. And so that's kind of the next level of disruptive. Okay. And so number 3 is probably the most disruptive, is disobedience by protest. And so this is kind of the last resort that engineers can do, and it's when they feel so strongly opposed to the actions of the company that they feel the need to really speak out against it. Okay. And so the most common forms of protest that occur will be something like whistleblowing, which we'll go over soon, or even in the extreme cases, it might even come in the form of a strike. Okay, and so workers, they have the option, and usually it's a lot more effective when a lot of people do it, to withhold their work, to get the company to take action on a certain topic. Okay. And this actually might be really relevant very soon too. And so probably you guys aren't really following this, but next semester it could there might actually be a strike among Cal State faculty, just because we're trying to negotiate a new collective bargaining contract with the chancellor's office, and the chancellor's being very stingy about it, and so they really don't want to give us any raises or anything like that. And so there might be a strike incoming next semester. So just want to make you guys aware of it. Okay, and so the next thing we're going to talk about is whistleblowing, and so what that looks like. And so before we get there, are there any questions on this? Can you pretend to be a faculty and join the fight? It's not it's not going to. Hopefully, we don't get to that point. I think everyone involved doesn't want it to get to that point. But everyone. But we all have to fight for kind of our fair rights too. So that's kind of where we're at. Absolutely, yes, yeah. Yeah, that's the thing that. Well, actually, no, I shouldn't talk about it. Yeah. Okay. Back to the lecture. Thanks. Enough talking about that stuff. Any questions on this stuff? Okay. All right. So let's talk about whistleblowing. All right. And so whistleblowing, I think everyone's kind of familiar with the concept, just because you've probably heard it in the news, or maybe heard it in a movie or something like that. Okay, but let's give a formal definition for whistleblowing, in the context of what we're going to talk about. Okay. Right. And so the name whistleblowing. I think the intuitive reasoning behind it is it kind of makes you think of like a referee in a sporting game, right? And so when like basketball players or soccer players commit a foul, then the ref blows his whistle, and then it stops all play, right? And so that's kind of the image that this is meant to conjure up. Although I think the exact origins of the word are actually a little bit different. Yeah, I remember reading it a couple years ago, but I forgot at this point. Okay. But the formal definition for this is one who reveals wrongdoings within an organization to the public or those in positions of authority. Okay. Okay. And so basically, when say you're working for a company and you see something going on that you think is really wrong, then if you want to be a whistleblower, then you're going to bring that information to the outside. Okay. And so a lot of times, people come to the press with this information, or they might come to a government body with it as well. Okay. And so let's kind of break apart this definition. Okay. And so kind of the key word in this whistleblowing definition is that it has to come from within the organization. Okay. Okay. And so it's when someone outside the organization calls out a company on its wrongdoings, that's not considered a whistleblower, because that's someone that's kind of outside the company. Okay. So most of the time when you have a whistleblower, it's someone from within the company, within the organization. Okay. And that's not that's not by coincidence. Okay. And so the reason this is that people that work within the company, they're usually aware, or they're usually knowledgeable of certain information of how the company works that people on the outside may not be aware of. Okay. Okay. Think back to the story that we talked about, before, at the beginning of our health and safety unit, right? And so that person, was aware of his of the interaction between NASA and his company, Martin Mariota, right? And so, because he was privy to that information and he went public, that's considered a whistleblower. All right, question. So not all whistleblowers are protected, though. So it depends, and so it definitely depends how you go about it. Okay. And there's definitely there's definitely kind of responsible ways to do it to kind of protect yourself. Okay. And so in an ideal world, there should always be protections for whistleblowers, right? Especially if they're acting in good faith. And so if they're acting to prevent some kind of wrongdoing, or they're acting to protect the public, right? So there should always be protections on that. But with kind of how today's world is, it's sometimes it's a lot easier said than done, and people can find information on certain people, whether you want it or not. So in an ideal world, they should all be protected, but the reality is something different. And so you just have to be a little bit careful with how you whistleblow, which is what we're going to talk about today. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the different kinds of whistleblowing that you can do. Okay. Right, and so there's two broad categories of internal versus external whistleblowing. Okay, and this refers to whether you're going to bring your whistleblowing complaint, if you're going to keep it within the company, or if you're going to go to an outside agency. Okay. All right, so internal whistleblowing. Usually, you're going to report an incident to someone within the company, but usually someone outside your department. Okay. right? And so a lot of cases of this, it's of this happening is, maybe your immediate manager or the person right above you is misbehaving, or he's doing something that you don't agree with, right? And so you can either take that information and you can report it to HR, you can report it to like an ethics officer within your company, or you can even go even higher up than your manager, okay? And so that would be one instance of doing this, okay? And I know we talked about it briefly a couple weeks ago about how effective this actually is, right? Because at the end of the day, everyone that works in your company, is there, in support of the company, right? And so, if you report an incident to someone within the company, that might not be something that's productive, okay? Okay. And so a lot of times, they, in addition, in the best cases, they have your best interests at heart, but also they have the company's best interests at heart as well. And so, and in the worst of cases, they don't have your best interests at heart at all. And so, they're going to be there to protect the company. Okay. And so just be aware of that. Okay. And not all companies are like that. And so, the effectiveness of the HR department and how effective internal whistleblowing is, that varies from company to company for sure. And that's something that you can get a pulse of, by talking to other people who have worked there at a longer time. Okay. But usually this is a good faith gesture. And so, if you want your company to work together with you to resolve issues, usually it's a good faith gesture to try their internal channels first, before you go outside. Okay. Because if you go outside the company immediately, then that can breed some bad faith, or breed some animosity, right? And a lot of times you don't want that, because ultimately, you want a symbiotic relationship between you and your company. So you want to show them that you also have are trying to work things out together with them, right? Instead of just trying to take them down. Okay. But just be aware that sometimes you might be disappointed in the results if you just go internally. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. And so the other type of whistleblowing that you can do, of course, is external whistleblowing. Okay. And just like the name implies, this is when the engineer goes outside the company to report some kind of wrongdoing, okay? Either to some kind of government agency or to the press. Okay. Okay. Or actually, what's even more relevant nowadays, that you can go to social media as well. Okay. Or question: so would it be considered some sort of espionage? So, there are companies do try to protect themselves against that, and so for a lot of companies that are working on projects where information is sensitive, they'll of course make you sign a non-disclosure agreement, or NDA. Okay. And with that non-disclosure agreement, there's going to be punishments and penalties if you do reveal information outside. Okay. And so, that is something that, that companies use to protect themselves. And, and most times, because you sign that document, you agree to any of those penalties as well. Yeah. And so, not that people do this intentionally, because it's hard to ask anyone to ruin their career, just to get some information for one company, right? Especially a job like engineering where you have to go to school for so long, right? And so you say you work for Google, and they said, all right, and Google says, all right, I want you to sacrifice your career, go work at Amazon and get us information for Google, but after that, you won't be able to work in the industry ever again. So, that's most people usually are not going to do that. Yeah. Mhm. All right. And so, you have a lot of options when you want to go external, right? But the safest option, so the one that where it's gonna offer you protections, is if you go to a government agency. Okay. Right. So that's usually the one that's recommended, just because, if you go to the press, there's no guarantee that they can protect your identity, because, what they're not really interested. A lot of times they're not really interested in making positive change, for the company, for the industry. A lot of times they're just interested in how many clicks can they get on an article, or, how many viewers can they get for a news video, right? But if you go to a government agency, they have procedures, they have protocols that are used in order to protect your identity. Okay, and so that's usually the way to go. Okay. And that's what you want too. So you don't, if you want to be a whistleblower, you typically don't want to reveal your identity, outside, just because that's going to put a target on your back for a lot of reasons that you don't want. Okay. Okay. And so, there's, that's usually the way that people do it. And I think recently, actually, there was a whistleblower for Facebook. I believe they went to the government, and they talked about a lot of the practices that Facebook does. And so, it's a regular thing. So people still are doing it, just because companies, they be doing some shady stuff sometimes, and people need to call them out, right? And so, that's still, I believe that's still an investigation that's ongoing. Okay. Okay. And so, if you do decide to whistleblow, just be aware that it is a very serious thing. Okay. And so it's not something to be taken lightly. Okay. And so, if you do want to whistleblow, make sure there's a very strong justification for doing so. Okay. And so some justifications that are definitely noteworthy is to prevent harm to the public, right? And so public safety, we talk about, is always the #1 priority for an engineer from an ethical point of view. Okay. And so if your whistleblowing can help prevent harm to the public, that's always a justifiable reason to whistleblow. Okay. Okay. maybe the company might be releasing a defective product, or maybe there's a certain service that that's taking advantage of people, exploiting some of their privacy or something. Okay. And so whenever this is the case, these are strong justifications for an engineer to go to whistleblow on this. Okay. Then that's usually a good reason. Okay. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, love canal. For those of you who did that for homework 6, that's that's definitely a strong justification for that. Yeah. Oh, speaking of that, I should have mentioned at the beginning. So if you haven't noticed already, your grades for homework 6 are up, and so I read all of your papers over the Thanksgiving break. Okay. And included with your grade is also a rubric. Okay, so the rubric, I used the same rubric that that I gave you for the homework assignment. Okay, and so you can see how your score is broken down on that rubric. And I also left a lot of comments, and so I try to be as descriptive as I could with comments on your report. So make sure you're reading those comments and make sure you incorporate them for your final project. Okay. And that's a big reason why I have this writing assignment, before the final report, is so that you can get some feedback from me and incorporate it onto your final report, so that your final report is a higher quality. Yeah. Was it tiring to read? Yeah. It was a lot. I mean, it's always a lot to read, but it's important, because the final report is a lot of work for you guys, and and I want to make sure that you guys have all the resources and all the feedback from me as possible to do as best as you can. Okay. Because I've always hated it, when I was a student, when I would get assigned a project, and it would be a crazy amount of work, but I would have no idea what the professor's looking for, or what I should be doing in certain situations. So I wanted to give an opportunity for me to get some feedback to you on that, before you embark in such a big project. A's for all. I can't do that. I definitely can't do that. Yeah. I would be whistleblown on if I got A's, if I gave A's to everyone. You tried. That's true. It's true. Can't fault you for trying. Okay. All right. Anyway, back to whistleblowing, right? And so, if you are going to whistleblow, make sure you have as much documented evidence as possible. Okay. Okay. As with anything, right? And so, try to document it as much as you can. So try to save, as many, technical documents, emails from people, memos, right? So try to save as many of these as you can to kind of help build your case, right? Because 100% of the time, if you whistleblow, the company is going to fight you on it, right? And so there's never been a case in the real world where someone blew the whistle and the company's like, oh yeah, my bad, we shouldn't have done that, let us correct our actions. That has never happened in the history of forever. Okay. And so the company is going to deny it. They're going to fight you on it. So the more evidence that you have, the stronger case that you're going to build to about for your whistleblowing case. Okay. But even so, even if you don't have the most evidence as possible, that's not a reason to not whistleblow at all, right? Especially if you think that if the company continues with their actions, it's going to cause a lot of harm to the public, right? And so that reason is often compelling enough, for you to blow the whistle, for you to go outside the company to to try to rectify the situation. Okay, but the more evidence you have is the better, the better it's going to be. And so another strong reason why you might whistleblow is to avoid what's known as complicity. And what that means is that you want to avoid a situation where your company is doing something bad, and tacitly kind of approving their actions by going along with it. Okay. And so if you suspect that your company's up to or your company's doing something you don't approve of, if you whistleblow on that, then that's one way of saying that I don't approve these actions, and I don't want them to continue it. Okay. And so avoiding that complicity might actually save you a lot of trouble in the long run, especially if the company comes under a lawsuit. Right. Okay. If a larger group is throwing a strike, would documentation still be needed? Absolutely. Yeah. And so documentation is always helpful, no matter how big a group that you have, whistleblowing or giving a strike or doing a strike. Yeah. Especially if it's documentations of communication from from the people that you want to blow the whistle on, right? So the more documentation, the more people that you have, it's always going to be helpful. Okay. All right. And so by avoiding complicity, that can ultimately protect you a lot more in the long run as well. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. And so one other thing I want to say is that if you and so whistleblowing is not just limited to just your own company too. And so you can blow the whistle on other companies that you might work with, right? And so it might be a client of yours, or might be a partner company, right? And so it's possible to whistleblow on them as well, right? Especially if you're knowledgeable about some of their of the way that they conduct business, or or the safety of their products, right? And so one example of this is a lot of times when a new building is constructed, there's collaboration between the company that's designing the building, and then there's also collaboration between them and the construction company, right? And so a lot of times these two companies are going to share a lot of technical documents and such, right? But if you're the construction company and you see that that the designs that the design company that are giving you are not up to code, but they're telling you to continue with the construction anyway, then that's a good reason to blow the whistle on them, in order to get them to change. Question. So is there a standard way to whistleblow, or does it depend on the issue with sufficient evidence? It does depend, unfortunately, it's one of those things where it strongly depends. It depends on the severity of the issue. It depends on how much evidence that you have. But if it's a case where it's like a partner company, maybe it's not your own, then that's the situation where I think you can have faith that your own internal channels would help with that, because it's going to be in your company's best interest to call them out on it, because your company doesn't want to be complicit in their wrongdoings as well. Yeah. And so that would be a situation where I think the internal channels would be really effective. But depending on the people involved and depending on the issue, it's that changes a lot of what you can do. Yeah. Would I say that Snowden was in the right? I think this is not the place to discuss that, but we can if you want to talk after class or something like that, then we can talk about it. Yeah. Would you need to have something typed up for whistleblowing, or is it more just like talking? So I will say a lot of the times, companies will try to not have as many things in writing as possible. And so they're gonna ask you to talk on the phone, or they're gonna ask you to talk in person, right? And so they want to avoid as much in writing as possible. But and so having things typed up or written up is not a requirement, but of course it always helps. Yeah. And so if you're an employee and your boss is asking you, or your manager is asking you to talk in person a lot or talk on the phone a lot, then just be aware of that when you have kind of in-person conversations like that, then it's a lot of times it's very hard to prove someone said something or another. Okay. But if you can get it in an email, then that's hard proof, because then they definitely wrote that email, and you can verify that within your inbox and things like that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. And so with that said, let's let's talk. I have five points of practical advice for, if you do decide to whistleblow. Okay. Okay. All right. And so these 5 points of advice will help, not only protect you, but also kind of protect, your relationship with your company as well. If you do want to go, if you do feel the need to whistleblow. Okay. All right. Number one. So number one, we've kind of already talked about before, but try to actually take advantage of the internal channels within your company when you're lodging complaints. Okay. Okay. And so, kind of like what we said at the beginning of this unit, where, even though, we've, especially today, we've talked a lot about how managers and companies, we're kind of painting them in a bad light. But a lot of times, a lot of managers out there in the world are good people, right? And so they're going to want to work with you, and they're going to want to, try to resolve things, as cleanly as possible. And so, try to do that first, right? So talk to your manager about it, hopefully, they're good, and they actually help work you through it. Okay. And so maybe not, if your manager's not, it doesn't make sense to talk to your manager about it, try someone in HR, or try someone like an ethics officer in your company as well. Okay. And so try that first, because it's, usually it kind of breeds bad blood, when workers will go just kind of straight to the press or straight to the government agency about a complaint. Okay. All right, number two is to think about whether it's best to keep it confidential or to try to involve other people. Okay. Okay. And unfortunately, this is another one of those things where I can't give you a hard answer on, what's the best thing to do or not. Okay, because it really depends on the situation. Okay. And so for some issues, it may be best to deal with it as privately as possible. A lot of times those cases have to do with some kind of workplace harassment. Okay. And so those cases you want to handle those confidentially. But sometimes, it might be better to try to get others involved, to try to show that a large group of people feel a certain way. Okay. Because if you have concerns about, the way the company's developing a product, if you have safety concerns, right, you don't want management to think that, you're the only one that thinks this way. And so if you try to get more and more people to to be that share the same opinion, that's much more likely to be compelling for management to actually go and change something. Okay. And so, depending on the nature of the problem and depending on, your relationship with your management, determine whether it's best, to involve others or keep it confidential. Okay. And so, I'm sorry that I can't give better guidelines than that, but, it's what I'm saying is, it's something that you should think about when you're doing this. Okay. All right. Number three is to focus on issues, not personalities. Okay. So this is something we talked about last time too. Right? And I will say that, this is something that I'm working out a lot as well, right? Especially, as we're going through contract negotiations with the chancellor, right? So I have very strong opinions of the chancellor, but I have to remember that it's not him as a person that I have an issue with. It's the way that he's handling the job, right? And so, focus on those things and, avoid personal attacks, because, that's never a productive thing. Okay. You might feel good in the moment, calling someone a certain name, right? Or saying that they are a terrible person, right? It might feel good in the moment, but ultimately it doesn't actually get you closer towards your goals. Okay. And so definitely focus on issues, but don't focus on the people involved. Okay. All right, number 4. So number 4 is to keep as many written records as possible. Okay. And so, we've talked about this one as well, right? And so if you do want to whistleblow, the more written records or the more documentation that you have, the stronger your case is. Okay. And you can push back on certain things too, right? And so, a lot of times, probably a lot of you will go and work for companies, and your manager, your boss might say, "Oh, can I speak with you in my office, or can we speak on the phone?" Right? You can push back on that, and so you can say that you can say, "I prefer to keep this on email," and so can we discuss it here, right? And that's always a good thing to ask, because if your manager says no, then that's also documentation as well, right? And so you can have that. You can have that email to say that you try to resolve this through email, but your manager said no about it, right? And so that of course always is going to raise some questions. Okay, and so try to keep things as much written evidence as possible. Okay. And number 5. And so number 5 is to always be constructive. And so it's not enough to just say or just make note that your company is doing wrong stuff. Okay. Try to offer suggestions on how they can improve. Okay. Okay. And so this always makes things go better. Whenever you're criticizing someone, or you want to or you're objecting to their behavior, offer ways that they can improve. And I think that always makes these kinds of conversations go better. Yeah. All right. And so that's it for whistleblowing. And so we have about 20 minutes left in class. And so I am going to start the next lecture notes on environmental ethics. But before we get there, are there any questions on whistleblowing? Okay. All right. And so let's move on to the next topic, which is environmental ethics. Okay. And I only have about one lecture's worth of content on environmental ethics, but I feel like this is something that's really evolved a lot over the last few years. And unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to update these lecture notes yet. But it is a very important topic that that we have to cover. What about if you want testimonies? It would be hard to obtain them, right? Yeah, so it's you can get those. I mean, you can definitely ask your coworkers or ask your colleagues for them, right? And so it all depends on what people are willing to do. You can never force anyone to give you a testimony for something, though, and so that's important to remember. Right? So you have to always respect people's privacy, and you have to always respect with people don't want to engage in a certain kind of thing, right? And so, just remember, always be respectful of that, and then it's but you can always ask, right? And so that's never bad. All right. So the environment, okay, and so the engineers engineers just historically have a very I would say complicated relationship with the natural environment, okay, because you have kind of two ways that you can look at it. Okay? Okay. And so on the one hand, we have a lot of the technologies that we use today that contribute to pollution. Engineers had a big hand in developing this. Okay? And so things like the automobile, things like airplanes, right? Things like coal mining factories, right? So of course, engineers had a big hand in developing a lot of these technologies, and we're seeing a lot of the negative consequences that they have on the environment. Okay, and so that's one way to kind of look at it. Okay? The other way to look at it is that a lot of the solutions to these environmental issues or environmental problems is going to require the development of new technology, right? And so better ways that we can drive our cars, or better ways that we can, have to harvest energy, right? And so engineers, of course, are going to be a big part of this process as well. Okay. Okay. And so there's kind of two ways to this, right? And so on the one hand, we have to recognize that engineers, develop a lot of these technologies in the past that contribute to these problems. Not that we were aware of these issues before, of course not, but but a lot of them are still in use right now. Okay, and moving forward, engineers are going to be a big part of these solutions as well. Okay, and so just kind of naturally we have these kind of two these two these two sides of kind of the same coin. Okay, and so that kind of begs the question of because we have these two big roles that engineers play, a fair question to ask is what are the professional obligations that engineers have in terms of the environment. And so professionally, what are we obligated to do towards the environment? Okay. And so, the first, whenever we talk about professional obligations, the first thing that we can look at are the professional engineering codes, right? And so we can look at the IEEE codes, the NSPE codes, right? All of these are great resources for you to know is that, what are my obligations as an engineer towards this, okay? And, when I wrote these notes a few years ago, surprisingly, the professional codes actually say very little about the environment. Okay? They might have been updated now. So I haven't taken a close read through all the codes of ethics recently, and they might have been updated just because the environment has been such a a public issue, over the last couple of years. But when I wrote these notes originally, there wasn't much there on the environment. Okay. Which might be surprising to some, right? And so it might be surprising that when you talk about kind of the natural environment, and we talk about kind of the 2 points that I have here on this page, that the professional codes don't really say anything about the environment. Okay. But think about the reason why the engineering codes were written to begin with, right? So the reason the engineering codes were written was to protect human safety first and foremost, right? And so that's always going to be the the number one concern for engineers, right? Is to protect human safety, right? And so environmental protection, doesn't a lot of times, doesn't really make it into those codes, because the environment doesn't have a direct effect on human health, right? I think we're at a point now where we're seeing that there are a lot of long-term consequences, right? So if we pollute the air, or if we continue on with climate change, then this is going to have a lot of long-term negative consequences on human health. But immediately, the development of a product, if it harms the environment, doesn't have an immediate consequence on human health and safety. Okay, and that's kind of the logic that that the engineering codes used, when they were writing, when they were written. Okay? With that said, it might be different now, and so if you read the IEEE codes or the NSPE code, there might be tenets in there, or there might be statements on there about protecting the environment. But as of now, there wasn't, or as of when I wrote these notes, there was surprisingly very little, and it had to do with the fact that the engineering codes are written for human safety, not necessarily environmental protection. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. And so with that said, the main driving force behind environmental concerns for engineering products actually comes from the government. Okay. And so there's kind of a long history of the federal government enacting, our federal and state government enacting laws on how engineering can be performed, in order to protect the environment. Okay. And so, there's a long list of kind of federal regulations and a lot of court cases actually that have to do with the government's involvement in engineering work to protect the environment. Okay. All right, so let's. So I wanted to go over a few of the landmark actions that the government proposed that had kind of the biggest influence on engineering. Okay. All right, and so the first one is in 1969. Okay, and in 1969, Congress passed what's called the National Environmental Policy Act. Okay. And so what this act did was it declared what's called a national policy, which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment. Okay. So I'm gonna put that in quotes because that becomes that's actual verbiage from the act. Okay. Okay. And as a result of this act, the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, was established. Okay. Okay. Because with this act, and it was a fairly comprehensive act, there were a lot of mandates that were created to, in order to protect the environment. And the EPA is basically the government's way of enforcing those mandates. Okay. And so, the EPA, they meet with engineering companies all the time just to make sure that their work is meeting, government standards, regulation standards. Okay. And and the EPA, of course, still exists today, right? And so it was kind of a landmark act, that still, is being active even today's time. Okay. All right. So another landmark act actually took place in the year right after that, and it's called the Clean Air Act, and that happened in 1970. Okay. And so in the Clean Air Act, this was an act specifically aimed towards, protecting the air. Okay. And so this placed a lot of regulations on technologies that put out pollutants into the air. Okay. And so this act places health considerations ahead of balancing cost and benefits. Okay. Okay. Because a lot of the companies that were contributing to these particulate pollutants, they had to spend some money to regulate it. Yeah. Question. So there wasn't that many environmental regulations during the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. And so, the first, big movement towards environmental regulations, started now. And so there wasn't much, at least from the federal level about these, before those times. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right, and so one more landmark piece of legislation that I want to go over is the Pollution Prevention Act of 1990. And so this took place about 20 years after that. And so in the Pollution Prevention Act, this kind of put a shift in how we deal with pollution, in America. Okay. Okay. And so before this act, it was the stance that was usually adopted was that we can pollute stuff as long as we clean it up, right? And so there was a kind of like a mindset of of management and of cleaning up. Okay. And so but with the passage of this act, our focus then shifted from the best way to manage pollution is to prevent it from happening to begin with. Okay. Okay. Exactly. Yeah. And so it went from just clean it up to don't do it. Right. And so I'm not sure if any of you are old enough to remember, but I remember watching a lot of a lot of children's TV back in the 90s where there's a big campaign for the 3 R's, right? And so reduce, reuse, recycle, right? And so that was part of this pollution prevention act, right? And so if you could either reduce the amount of waste that you produce, or reuse something that you have, or in the last possible case, recycle it. That's a great way for us to prevent pollution and all of these environmental issues to begin with, right? And so the R campaign was kind of part of this Pollution Prevention Act. Yeah. So 3 R's, are still important. I don't really see it as much nowadays, but I'm also not really watching any children's television, and so I don't know if it's still a thing, but definitely reduce, reuse, recycle. That was what I learned back then, along with watching a lot of Captain Planet growing up. That was my jam. Yeah. Okay, that's good. So there's so the 3 R's are still active. Yeah. All right. Any final questions on this? All right, and so that's all we got time for today. And so on Thursday, when we pick this up, we'll talk a bit more about the environment, and specifically in terms of some pivotal court cases that that played a big role. And then we'll talk a little bit about computer safety and privacy. Okay, and so we'll try to get as much done as we can, because Thursday is our last lecture session before we do our final presentations. Okay, and so remember, probably tomorrow afternoon, I'll put out the sign up sheet for the presentation order. Okay, so make sure you're aware of that. Okay, I think today I'll send an email telling what time I'm going to put out the sign up sheet. So I'm thinking probably around noon tomorrow, but I'll send an email just to confirm that. Okay? And then by noon tomorrow, I'll send an email with that sign up sheet where you can sign up for a time. Okay. And of course, if you have constraints about, when you can present, I know a couple of you have talked to me already, then please let me know, and then I'll make sure that your group goes on a certain day. Okay. All right. So thank you guys for coming today. I know it's the end of the semester and after Thanksgiving, and so I know it's a little bit of Thanksgiving hangover. So I appreciate you guys coming out. So hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon, and I will see you on Thursday. Thanks, you too. Janelle, did you have any other questions? Okay, all right, I'm going to close the call then. See you Thursday.